Isaac Bashevis Singer tells a story called The Power of Light. During World War II, after the Nazis had bombed the Warsaw Ghetto, a boy and a girl were hiding in the ruins. David, 14 years old, and Rebecca, 13. It was winter and bitterly cold. For weeks, Rebecca had not left the dark, partially collapsed cellar that was their hiding place. But every few days, David would go out in search of food. "Rebecca," David called, "I found a treasure." "What kind of treasure?" "Cheese, potatoes, dried mushrooms, and a package of candy. And I have another surprise for you that I'll show you after we eat." Both were too hungry for talk. And ravenously, they ate those potatoes and mushrooms and a little bit of the cheese. And they each had one piece of candy. And after a while, Rebecca asked, "What's the surprise?" "Rebecca, today is the first day of Hanukkah, and I found a candle and some matches." "Hanukkah is tonight?" "Yes, tonight is the first night. Let's bless this Hanukkah candle," David said. He lit a match, and he lighted the candle, and Rebecca blinked her eyes. There was light. For the first time in weeks, she really saw David. His hair was matted, and his face was covered with dirt, but his eyes shone with joy. In spite of starvation and misery, David had grown taller. And young as they both were, they had decided they would marry if they could manage to escape from Warsaw. They had both lost their family, and they had good reason to be angry with God for sending them so many afflictions. But the light of that candle brought peace into their souls. That glimmer of light, surrounded by so many shadows, seemed to say without words, "A spark of hope is still left." Somewhere in the forest outside Warsaw, there were young men and young women called partisans who were fighting the Nazi invaders. David wanted to reach them. And now, by the light of the Hanukkah candle, Rebecca suddenly felt renewed courage. She said, "David, let's leave when you think it's the right time." "The right time is now, and I have a plan," said David. For a long time, he explained the details of his plan to Rebecca. It was more than risky. But to remain in the cellar for winter would mean certain death, and so Rebecca and he agreed to leave. They packed their remaining food in a kerchief, and David took his matches and a piece of lead pipe for protection. David and Rebecca were soon on their way through the ruins. They came to passages so narrow they had to crawl on their hands and knees. But the food they had eaten and the joy that Hanukkah candle had awakened in them gave them the courage to continue. Even though the partisans were not far from Warsaw, it took David and Rebecca a week to reach them. In one village, they encountered a Jewish partisan who had come to get some food for his group. This young man brought David and Rebecca to the partisans who roamed the forest. This was the last day of Hanukkah, and that night, they and the partisan lit 8 candles. They joined more and more refugees who all had but one desire: to leave for the land of Israel. They walked, they slept in stables, in burnt-out houses, wherever they could hide from the enemy, making their way to a boat leaving from Yugoslavia. Then, perilously, they sailed across the water to Israel. Basically healthy, their bodies recovered fairly quickly from the devastation of war. They learned Hebrew, studied diligently, worked hard, and when Rebecca turned 18, they were married. Isaac Bashevis Singer learned this story from Rebecca while sitting at her kitchen table in Tel Aviv many years later. Rebecca closed her telling of their story with these words to Singer: "If it had not been for that little candle David brought into our hiding place, we wouldn't be sitting here today. That glimmer of light awakened in us a hope and a strength that we didn't know we possessed." A glimmer of light that leads to hope and strength. A hope and a strength we don't know we possess. That's something we can all use in this season where we are spoon-fed visions of entitlement, of indulgence, of ridiculously high expectations. It's easy to get mired down in the melancholy of the waning light and the increasing demands on our time at this time of year. For most of us, the season brings higher level of stress, extended family coming to stay, the obligation to travel, to serve as host, and overwhelming feelings brought on by rampant commercial pleas for our patronage. And for others, the holiday season is especially challenging. These challenges come in many varieties: having kids at home after they've left the nest, spending longer hours at work, facing holiday gatherings while being treated for an illness, or grieving the loss of a loved one. With all these difficulties and distractions, it can be hard to look at the reality of what is good and joyful about the holiday season. So we need to shed a little light, and Rebecca and David's Hanukkah account points us towards two practices that help us find our balance: holding on to hope and appreciation, and sensing our strength and our connectedness. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm the principle that each of us is a part of the interconnected web of existence. We know we can't get by without a little help from our friends, and we need each other. When we think about Rebecca and David, they knew this strength at a gut level. It was a live or die proposition: connect with each other, make their way to a connection with their community of partisans, and then make a larger journey to a connection with their faith family. It was truly the only way to live. Now, the situation may be different here for us today, but the human need is the same. Life is better lived in connection. Several years ago, I took a positive psychology class at Stanford Continuing Studies, and the instructor, Laura De Lozana, taught practices that increase a sense of well-being based on scientific research. One finding in the class really impressed me. Those who report being in the top 10% of consistently happy people have a behavior pattern that was identified by researchers. The happy folks put out bids for connection. The bids for connection that the happy people extended took the form of reaching out in small ways. The happiest people in the research study made dates to go for walks with friends, took 5 minutes to listen to a coworker, talk at the water cooler, asked an acquaintance about how his kid's doing on the basketball team. They smiled, they made eye contact, and they used a friendly tone when speaking. These folks consistently reached out for connection with others. The good news in this is that people who had not initially scored in the happiest 10%, when they took up this practice of putting out bids for connection, they reported greater levels of happiness on follow-up studies. The bottom line: you don't have to be born a cheery party planning sort. You can access a reserve of joy by reaching out your hand, practicing the art of being present and seeking engagement. It's what our UU values speak to, this interconnected web of life, taking time to connect and to savor the inherent worth and dignity of those about us. It's how we do being a UU. Holding hands with the circle of our loved ones, our church family, our biological family, our wider community, we find balance. When we are wobbly, our connections support us. We shore each other up when the journey feels long. It's embodied. It's something we can do to make the winter season warmer, giving ourselves the gift of being wrapped in a blanket we have woven with the fibers of kinship. Now, balance through connection comes when we see the way ahead by breaking out of our hiding spaces. Rebecca and David hid themselves in the dark, partially collapsed cellar to be safe, which was just what they needed at one point in time. But when the situation changed, they knew that hiding wasn't going to bring them to safety. They knew what Tracy told us so well in her story, that there was more love somewhere. Yes, vulnerability is hard, reaching out beyond our safe spaces. But authentic connection comes only when we are in touch with our deeper self and willing to share that deeper self with others. The poet Rumi has a few lines in his poem, Say Yes Quickly, that make this point well. Forget your life. Say God is great. Get up. Reach out your long hands out to another door beyond where you go on the street where everyone says, "How are you?" and no one says, "How aren't you?" Good, isn't it? Tomorrow you see what you've broken and torn tonight, thrashing in the dark. If you've opened your loving to God's love, you are helping people you don't know and have never seen. Rumi is telling us to resist the shell of disingenuous and push away false fronts that are so tempting to try on when the commercial world is selling them on every street corner at this time of year. It's wise to take this poet's advice, to go into the wider world with the intent to hear reality and not allow ourselves to be taken in by fanciful facades. When we are genuine and true, we are luminous. We are beams of sacred light that stretch beyond our own line of vision. As Rumi says, by being genuine, we reach people we don't know and have never seen. In David and Rebecca's story, the Hanukkah candle was a beacon, shining a light of hope. By casting that light, the candle illuminated for Rebecca what was in her midst. She could recognize her blessings. Her young boyfriend, whose eyes shone with joy, the food they had to eat, the glimmer of an escape plan. These were the things that would give her hope to carry on. I wondered, do you count your blessings? I'd like to ask you to take just a moment right now. Think of one thing you really appreciate. Just hold it fast for a moment. Appreciating something feels good, doesn't it? I'll tell you a secret about how I got better at appreciating the good things in my life. It came to me many years ago in a practice recommended by a friend who's a marriage and family therapist. Our friend suggested that my husband and I tell each other at the end of each day 3 things we appreciated about the other person. I'll tell you truthfully, this practice felt awkward and kind of stilted and really goofy at first, honestly. But here's the thing. It was an eye-opener for me about all the things that my husband does that I appreciate. He carried his dishes to the sink and washed them. The lawn is mowed. His shoes are in the closet and not in the middle of the floor. The practice was a game changer. And here it is 7 years later, and we are still doing this every evening before we go to bed. The practice works in a few ways. It silenced the tapes in my head that had played a message of entitlement and unreasonable expectations. Now I am better at looking for the simple joys, appreciating the positive in my everyday life, and can better see my husband for the good soul that he is. I also hear words from him every night that tell me that I matter and that what I do is noticed too. The practice has helped me to notice all kinds of lovely things in the wider world too. Several times a day, I'll stop and I'll take a mental snapshot of a moment that I am feeling a deep sense of gratitude. I freeze in my mind an image of the feelings and the smells, the sights, the beauty, just capturing that joy of that particular moment. During the holiday season, I'll walk into my local Safeway and I'll go over to the produce section where the floral arrangements are, and I'll find the ones with the pine boughs in them. And I'll stand there and I take a big, deep breath. I love the smell of pine. It's a scent memory that connects me to joyful memories. Winter day playing in the snow in Michigan, lying under the family Christmas tree with my sister on the day we had decorated the tree and looking up at the decorations and the lights, and a wonderful backpacking trip through the pines in the Sierra. It all links together, and I appreciate the moment I'm in the past moments of joy, and I feel a glimmer of hope in my heart. In her book, Help, Thanks, and Wow, the 3 Essential Prayers, Anne Lamott puts it this way. Gorgeous, amazing things come into our lives when we are paying attention. Mangoes, grandnieces, Bach, ponds. This happens more often when we have as little expectations as possible. Astonishing material and revelation appear in our lives all the time. We just have to be open for business. This practice of appreciation opens us up, gives us the breathing room to slow down and see what's right here. We can see our circle of connectedness. Rebecca and David appreciated the blessings they were able to see when the candlelight illuminated their reasons for joy. This renewed hope helped them to step out of the deep, dark shadow and into the goodness of their holiday and hold fast to the possibilities of joy. We are energy, light, stars in the sky, and we can be beacons for each other. And we UUs are no caravan of despair. We appreciate the simple ingredients that make up our days. We balance ourselves by holding hands, linking arms together, helping to carry ourselves and each other along in genuine fellowship. We pledge anew to look for the light of joy in the here and now this holiday season. And we will shine a light that defies shadow, gives us strength, and sustains us through the frosty, dim light of winter. May it be so.